On the morning of October 25, 1944, a group of American sailors woke up to the worst possible news. Coming at them out of the darkness was the most powerful naval fleet Japan had ever assembled. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and leading the charge, the Yamato, the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever built. Standing in its way, 13 small American ships, destroyers and escort carriers, nicknamed tin cans by their own sailors because the armor was so thin, the crew joked that a stiff wind could sink them. These weren't elite warships. These were low-priority vessels. Their job was to protect supply lines and stay out of trouble. They had no business fighting battleships. And yet, what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of naval warfare. The tin cans attacked. To understand what happened off Samar, you need to understand what kind of war the United States and Japan were fighting by late 1944. It had been 3 years since Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. 3 years of brutal island-hopping campaigns. Disease, starvation, some of the deadliest naval battles in human history. By October 1944, the tide had clearly turned. American manufacturing power had overwhelmed Japan. New carriers were rolling out of shipyards faster than Japan could sink the old ones. American submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines. Japan was losing, but Japan's military leadership refused to accept it. Instead, they devised a plan so bold, some would say so reckless, that it stunned even their own admirals. The Americans had set their sights on the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return, and on October 20th, 1944, he did. American troops landed on the island of Leyte. For Japan, losing the Philippines meant losing everything. Cut off from Southeast Asian oil and resources, Japan's war machine would simply grind to a halt. So Admiral Sprague activated Operation Shogo, Operation Victory. The plan was staggeringly complex. Japan would use nearly its entire remaining fleet in a massive, coordinated trap. The goal: destroy the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf. The strategy was built around deception. A northern force, largely a decoy, would lure American Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing zone. It had carriers, but almost no aircraft left. It was bait. Meanwhile, two strike forces would attack from the west through the Philippine Islands, arriving at Leyte Gulf to crush the American landing fleet in a pincer. The largest of these, Center Force, was commanded by Admiral Takeo Kurita, 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, and at the front, the Yamato. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons at full load. Her main battery, 9 18-inch guns, fired shells that weighed as much as a small car. She could send those shells over 26 miles. Nothing in the American inventory could stop her at range. If Kurita's fleet reached Leyte Gulf, the American landing would be massacred. The Japanese plan almost fell apart before it started. American submarines spotted Kurita's fleet as it moved through the Palawan Passage on October 23rd. In a devastating ambush, the submarines sank 2 heavy cruisers and damaged a third. Kurita himself was thrown into the sea when his flagship went down. He had to be pulled out of the water. The next day, American carrier aircraft found Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea and attacked in waves. The massive Musashi Yamato's sister ship absorbed hit after hit, 19 torpedo strikes, 17 bomb hits. She finally rolled over and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita turned his fleet around. To American eyes watching from the air, it looked like the Japanese were retreating, crisis over. But Kurita hadn't given up. He turned around again. And then the Japanese decoy worked perfectly. Admiral Halsey received reports of the Japanese Northern Force, the carrier group with almost no aircraft. Halsey saw carriers. He took the bait completely. He took virtually his entire fleet, including the powerful battleship force that was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait, and charged north to destroy the Japanese carriers. The gate was open. In the early hours of October 25th, Kurita's battered but still formidable fleet slipped through San Bernardino Strait in complete darkness. No American ships, no warning. By dawn, he was rounding the northern tip of Samar Island, heading south, straight toward the American landing beaches at Leyte. Standing between Kurita and MacArthur's invasion fleet was Task Unit 77, 4-3. They called themselves Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Taffy 3's mission had been anti-submarine patrols and air support for troops on the beach. Their commander, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was a methodical officer who had no reason to expect anything more dangerous than that. The escort carriers were barely 500 feet long, 18 knots maximum speed, no armor, wooden flight decks. They carried mostly anti-submarine aircraft, not the fighters or torpedo bombers designed for ship killing. The destroyers were even smaller, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes designed to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. At 6:44 in the morning, a lookout spotted something on the horizon. Large pagoda-like superstructures, rising out of the sea. Japanese battleships. Then the shells started falling. The Japanese had loaded their shells with colored dye so their spotters could tell which ship was hitting what target. The waters around Taffy 3 erupted in columns of red, yellow, and green-tinted water, 50-foot towers of sea rising all around the small American ships. Admiral Sprague got on the radio. "Any station, this is Taffy 3. We are under attack by enemy surface forces, including battleships and cruisers." He called for help from every American force that could hear him. No one was close enough. Sprague had perhaps 2 minutes to think. Running was not an option. His carriers could make 18 knots. The Japanese cruisers chasing him could make 35. He would be run down in open water within the hour. Fighting with his carriers was not an option either. Their 5-inch guns couldn't penetrate Japanese cruiser armor even at point-blank range. Against a battleship, they barely scratched the paint. But Sprague had one resource no one expected: the audacity of the men around him. He ordered 3 things simultaneously. Every carrier would make smoke, dense, oily black smoke to blind Japanese gunners. Every available aircraft would launch immediately, with whatever they had aboard, even if that meant depth charges instead of bombs. And then he ordered something that stunned the officers on his bridge. He ordered his destroyers to attack, not retreat, not screen, attack. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston was ready before the order came. Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,200 tons, armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. Against the Yamato, she was a rowboat with a kitchen knife. Evans was a man built for this moment, half Cherokee, born in Oklahoma, a fighter to his bones. When Johnston received the attack order, Evans turned to his crew and said, "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet and went to maximum speed. At 18,000 yards, over 10 miles, she began firing her 5-inch guns at the Japanese cruisers. The shells bounced off their heavy armor like stones. It didn't matter. The goal wasn't to sink them. The goal was to draw their fire. Make them look at Johnston instead of the carriers. At 10,000 yards, 5 miles, she fired all 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. 3 hit. Kumano blew off her bow. She was out of the fight. But now Johnston was alone, deep inside the Japanese formation, with no torpedoes, taking fire from multiple directions. 3 14-inch shells from a battleship hit her simultaneously. They tore through her engine room. The lights went out. She lost a third of her speed. Johnston's crew kept firing. 3 more ships followed her into the attack. USS Hoole, USS Herman, and the destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. Even smaller, even lighter than the others. The torpedo attacks forced the Japanese into chaos. Naval doctrine required you to turn toward incoming torpedoes to present the smallest possible profile. Every time the American ships launched, the entire Japanese formation had to maneuver. Ships broke formation. Cruisers scattered. The tight, coordinated attack fell apart. The USS Hull took 40 hits from enemy fire and refused to sink. Shells from every caliber the Japanese had, from 5-inch guns to 14-inch main batteries. Her crew fought every gun that still worked until there was simply nothing left. Samuel B. Roberts charged a line of heavy cruisers and fired every torpedo she had. Then, out of torpedoes, she continued firing her 5-inch guns at point-blank range. Japanese shells eventually tore her apart from the inside. She went down in 20 minutes. Survivors later called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. While the destroyers charged, Taffy 3's aircraft flew mission after mission. Pilots who had launched with depth charges instead of bombs dropped them anyway, set to explode on contact, and watched them skip across Japanese decks. When they ran out of weapons completely, they made dry runs, pretending to attack, hoping the threat of another torpedo would force Japanese ships to keep maneuvering. Some pilots simply flew at Japanese bridges at low altitude, firing machine guns, because doing something was better than doing nothing. It worked. Not because the bullets pierced the armor, but because no one on those Japanese bridges knew what was coming next. Everything was smoke and chaos and torpedo attacks from every direction. Japanese communications broke down. Fleet cohesion dissolved. Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato and tried to make sense of what was happening. He had expected easy prey, transports and supply ships anchored at Leyte Gulf. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a furious battle. Torpedo wakes coming from every direction, aircraft attacking continuously, his formation a shambles. His staff began misidentifying the ships they were fighting. The escort carriers, small, boxy ships with flight decks, were reported as fleet carriers. The destroyers attacking so ferociously were reported as cruisers. Kurita became convinced he was fighting Halsey's Third Fleet. It was a catastrophic misreading of the situation. Halsey was 300 miles away chasing Japanese decoys. What Kurita was actually fighting was a handful of tin cans, crewed by men who had decided that dying in a charge was better than dying while running away. But their performance was so aggressive, so seemingly reckless, that Kurita couldn't believe they were merely escorts. No rational admiral sends destroyers against battleships alone. There had to be a major fleet behind them. At the same time, Kurita was getting desperate messages from other Japanese forces. The southern force had been destroyed at Surigao Strait. He had no air cover, no clear picture of the enemy. Submarines possibly lurking beneath him, and the American aircraft, landing on nearby fields to rearm and refuel, were returning for yet another attack wave. Kurita made his decision. He ordered center force to withdraw. At 9:11 in the morning, after fighting for nearly 2.5 hours with Leyte Gulf just over the horizon, Kurita turned around. The tin cans had stopped the most powerful surface fleet Japan could field. The cost was brutal. USS Johnston was gone. Commander Evans and most of her crew with her. Survivors reported that as Johnston finally went under, a Japanese destroyer officer stood on his bridge and saluted. USS Hoole was gone. USS Samuel B. Roberts was gone. Nearly 1,500 American sailors were killed, hundreds more wounded. Survivors spent hours in shark-infested waters waiting for rescue. But MacArthur's landing fleet survived intact. The Philippines were saved. Historians have debated Kurita's decision for 80 years. Some say he was simply confused, genuinely believed he was fighting a larger fleet. Some say he was exhausted, having nearly drowned 2 days before when his flagship was sunk. Some say he was a rational commander who calculated that his battered fleet, with no air cover and no clear picture of the enemy, couldn't survive to reach the objective. Some say he was a man who, in his heart, knew the war was already lost and couldn't bring himself to spend his sailors' lives on a mission that would change nothing. Purest survived the war and lived until 1977. He never gave a clear explanation. When asked about Leyte Gulf in his final years, he reportedly changed the subject. What we do know is this: the men of Taffy 3 made him doubt. They attacked so aggressively, with such complete disregard for their own survival, that they created in Purest's mind a picture of an enemy far stronger than the reality. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. So were several other officers from that engagement. The citations speak of extraordinary heroism. What they don't fully capture is the cold, clear calculation underneath the courage. If we don't do this, everyone dies. So we do this. That's not recklessness. That's the purest possible form of military decision-making. The Battle off Samar, technically a defeat for the Americans in almost every measurable category, resulted in one of the most significant American victories of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese called the Yamato the soul of their nation, the ultimate expression of power and naval might. On October 25, 1944, that soul turned away from a handful of tin cans. Not because those tin cans were powerful, but because the men inside them refused to act like they weren't. USS Johnston, USS Hoole, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Heroman. Small boys, Admiral Sprague called them in his battle report. The small boys who stopped the fleet